the influence of the Chinese, the ancient Chinese. What influence did they have on the educational system of the time and even leading up to the 1900s? So we will look again at the six elements under the Chinese civilization. What were the educational goals that the Chinese had to educate young people? Their goal was to prepare elites to govern the empire according to Confucian principles. Now, that is important to note. There are three key terms here. Elites. Elite means everybody was not meant to be educated. The common man did not receive an education. It was not seen important for the common man to receive education under the Chinese. Only the elite were required to receive an education, and there was a purpose to that too, because they had to govern the empire. Chinese had an empire. There had to be leaders and strong people up at the top and in the front, and that was the sole purpose of giving an education to young people under the Chinese. But there was also another limitation. The education these people got was limited to Confucian principles. Only what Confucius taught and thought was transmitted to the next generation. Nothing new was added from the outside. Who were the students? The students were only male members of the upper class of society. So we see that even years ago, that far away as ancient China, there was a class system. And only if you belonged to the upper class, and only if you happened to be a male member of the upper class, did you receive an education. Even females of the upper class were not required to receive any education. It was not thought of to be of any importance to educate girls. Instructional methods that were used were simply memorization and recitation. So, because it was limited to Confucian principles, all one had to do was to memorize those principles and then recite them from memory. So, there were only two things: learning by heart and repeating. Learning by heart and repeating. And if you were good at it, you moved on. If you were not good at it, you had to spend more time at a particular level till you got all the principles by heart, till you knew what they were, and you could recite them without making any errors. So again, primitive ways of teaching something, primitive ways of learning something, but that was the norm at the time. The curriculum was simply Confucian classics. Whatever Confucius had written, whatever Confucius had given to the Chinese people was to be transmitted from one generation to the next. So a very limited curriculum. Certainly we see from the pre-literate society, it's a shift, because pre-literate society only focused on survival skills. The Chinese are now moving beyond skills into actual knowledge and information, into actual content, teaching the classics that someone had put together, had written, put together, shared, were available, and that is what the Chinese were interested in spreading among their own young people. Who were the agents? Who were the teachers? Who taught these young men at that time? They were simply government officials. These were also young men who in the past or in the previous generations had learned the Confucian principles, had memorized them, could recite them, had got good positions in the government, and so these government officials now were preparing the next generation, and so on. The cycle continued, using the government officials to train the next generation. Influence on education. Written examinations were required for civil services. And civil services simply at that time were serving the Chinese empire. If you were a male of the upper class, if you got through the education and training and you were good, you had to sit for a written exam, clear the exam to get the positions. Otherwise, we know even in government service, you can have the bottom positions where people are also required. And so we see that the Chinese started an examination system. It's the beginnings of trying to learn, memorize, and reproduce stuff, things that we've seen even in our days, in our schools, in our classrooms.